Hello, and welcome to this side session to the OECD Forum on Due Diligence in the Garment and Footwear Sector, organized by Stitch. I see some participants are still joining in, but it's time. We have a lot of presentations to go, so let's start. Today, we'll be talking about meaningful stakeholder engagement in due diligence processes of garment brands. With this session, we aim to work towards industry alignment on this important topic. So before we get started, some practical points. This presentation is being recorded, but you won't be seen or heard because of the webinar setting that we have. And we ask you to please leave your questions in the chat. We will gather them and at the end we'll discuss them. And we also encourage you to add your comments in the chat and your thoughts. As a consortium, we are continuously improving our work on meaningful stakeholder engagement, so we are happy to hear from you for feedback, but also for possible collaborations and synergies in the future. So, what's on the agenda today? After a short introduction of Stitch and what is meaningful stakeholder engagement, we will have 6 speakers divided into 2 blocks. First, we will hear about the roles of stakeholders within meaningful stakeholder engagement. And in the second block, speakers will share concrete tools and examples on what meaningful stakeholder engagement can look like. And this by no means is a complete overview. We had to make a selection, so this is just a short insight on the things we are working on within Stitch. So about Stitch. Stitch is a consortium of 6 organizations who share a common vision, a global textile and garment industry that contributes to an equal and just society by respecting human rights in a world of work. The partnership follows after a previous partnership in which some of the members took part, and it will continue until at least 2025. Between us, we have access to all the key value chain stakeholders and actors, from trade unions and labor rights organizations to suppliers, employers associations, brands, and policy makers. We therefore have experience engaging with several stakeholders along garment supply chains. And with this presentation, we aim to share some of these experiences to work towards more industry alignment and collaboration on meaningful stakeholder engagement. We realize that the work that we do at Stitch is non-exhaustive, and therefore see room for collaboration. So that again, just as a disclaimer and as an invite to connect after this session. So when we talk about meaningful stakeholder engagement, what exactly do we mean? The base document for human rights due diligence that is often mentioned and that you probably all are aware of are the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Principle 18 covers meaningful stakeholder engagement and states that due diligence includes meaningful consultation with potentially affected groups and other relevant stakeholders. Now, this formed the basis for the OECD guidelines, and that states that companies should engage with relevant stakeholders to provide meaningful opportunities for their views to be taken into account. Now, the experts in the room will recognize that this is general policy number 14 from the 2011 version of the guidelines, which most of the participants here would have worked with over the last few years. And then there's also sector-specific guidelines from the OECD, such as the guidelines for responsible supply chains in the garment and footwear sector. This document gives additional information for the sector and states that companies should engage meaningfully with affected stakeholders as part of the due diligence process. Now, in 2023, so last year, there was an update on the general guidelines for multinational enterprises in which some of the wording changed. Now, it stayed mostly the same, but 2 points to mention is that it doesn't only speak about stakeholders, but also their legitimate representatives, and also mentions now meaningful stakeholder engagement as part of the due diligence process. Now, these can be seen as widely agreed international norms for companies that they should comply to, but these are voluntary. So over the years, several initiatives have taken place to create mandatory due diligence guidelines. It goes beyond this presentation to cover all of those initiatives, but one of them to mention here, which is important, is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And this EU legislation is also known as the CSDDD, and that states that companies should take appropriate measures to carry out effective engagement with stakeholders, and that consultations shall take place across all steps of the due diligence process. Now, this isn't in there literally, but the different steps can be recognized in Article 8D of that document. And that is, as the document stands at the moment, as we see the latest compromise, but we still have to wait until the final text is out. So even though meaningful stakeholder engagement is always useful, as it gives important insights in the supply chain, and it has been an international norm for many years, it will soon also become mandatory to do so. So there's no better time to dive into this concept. So for meaningful stakeholder engagement to be meaningful, a few principles are important. At Stitch, we have noticed some principles that are often present in our work. First of all, impact. The main method to measure if your engagement was meaningful is to check if it has brought about actual positive and systemic change for the stakeholder in question. And to know what is needed for that change to happen, stakeholders need to be consulted. So meaningful stakeholder engagement is centered around production country stakeholders. Their knowledge and experience are essential to improving working conditions sustainably. Meaningful stakeholder engagement is continuous. It's a continuous process, ongoing process, embedded throughout a brand's entire due diligence cycle. And lastly, it's based on collaboration. It's a two-way street and based on trust, on which we will hear later on in the first block of presentations. Now, collaboration between several stakeholders is needed. And because of the way we are structured as a consortium, and for us to focus, stakeholders are workers, their representatives, such as trade unions, but also suppliers. Many interventions focus on workers as rights holders, which is understandable, but suppliers are also really important, play an important role, and we need their support in order to reach workers. So to show how important collaboration is, you will hear from several actors, including a supplier, in the upcoming presentations. But before we dive into that, one last point, engagement can be organized in many different forms, ranging from consultation to collaboration. And what will work best, it depends on the situation and the context. But in the following presentations, you will hear some good examples. For example, assessment surveys, monitoring tools, grievance mechanisms, and social dialogue will be mentioned. At Stitch, we have experience with many other engagement methods that we'd like to share, but because of the time restraint, we had to make a selection. So with that, I would like to give the floor to our first speaker, which is Pradipan Ravi from Cividep.
Thank you, Tara. I'll share my screen now. Hello, everyone. I'm Pradipan Ravi, joining from India. I work with Cividep as programs lead. Today, I'm going to talk to you about human rights due diligence as a bottom-up approach, focusing on our experience and learning around stakeholder engagement in a research project on HRDD, which we undertook in 2022 under the Stitch program. Before going into the topic, I would like to introduce the organization I represent. Cividep is a labor support organization working to advance workers' rights and corporate accountability. We mainly work in industries that are part of global supply chains like garments, electronics, and leather. And our current work fall under three broad categories: worker engagement, worker-centric knowledge creation, and strategic communication on workers' issues. Let me now brief you about the research that we did on human rights due diligence under the STITCH program. Through the study, we aimed at developing and operationalizing a bottom-up framework for conducting a baseline human rights risk assessment in the Indian garment industry. Uh, uh, as you know, HRDD is a business process that companies are responsible for. We have no doubt about it, but this bottom-up framework we are presenting is about CSOs, is about how CSOs like us and trade unions can play an active role in stakeholders, as stakeholders in engaging with the HRDD discourse and practices. So for us, the entry point to HRDD as stakeholders begins from here. Through this study, we have captured prevalence and severity of labor rights risks in the three garment clusters in India, and also have established possible linkages with the contracting practices of the lead firms. So let me quickly explain the rationale for the study, why we took it up. If you see, international norms and regulations around responsible business conduct expect businesses to move beyond compliance and social audits. And businesses also have started to working on it by developing policies, systems, and practices for HRDD. In such a scenario, what is the role that CSOs and trade unions could play? So this is the question we have been asking ourselves. That's how the idea to approach HRDD from an impact point of view. Tara also mentioned in her when she spoke about how impact is relevant to stakeholder engagement. So we strongly felt that CSOs like us can play a key role in verifying and highlighting the impact that the HRDD systems and practices of the brands can have on workers' lives. Moving on. Now let me explain what we actually did in the study. So Cividep attempted at developing a customized human rights due diligence framework, which outlined an operational plan for conducting human rights due diligence throughout the value chain. We reviewed several HRDD frameworks like the ones recommended by OECD guidelines, and we also looked at other frameworks developed by multi-stakeholder initiatives and so on. So we also did an extensive literature review on legal requirement and best practices in the industry. And the framework that we designed through the process for the study covers two aspects. We call it the two pillars of our framework. First one is on employment outcomes and experiences of workers. We can also call it labor risks. And the second one is the buyer-supplier relationships, or we can also call it contracting practices. So this slide highlights the HRDD steps, which I'm sure most of us here are familiar with. These are the standard 5 standard steps in the HRDD process. And as you see, meaningful stakeholder engagement cuts across all the 5 steps. Our study covers only the first 2 steps, that is establishing the HRDD information system, and the second step of assessing and identifying human rights impact. So the rest of the 3 steps can only be done by businesses, as you know. Moving on. So in the first step, we established a human rights due diligence information system, basically by outlining the areas of human rights impacts and by defining the indicators or data points for collecting information on the same. So this has been done by referring to both national and international labor standards. So under the employment outcomes pillar that you see on your left, we have outlined 6 human rights risk areas from wage sufficiency to violence and abuse, for which data will be collected from workers directly. On your right, for the second pillar of contracting practices, 5 areas related to purchasing practices have been identified, such as contracting clauses, lead time, pricing strategy, and so on. For these, data is to be collected at the firm level from the suppliers. Now I will explain how we collected the data for both the pillars of the framework. This is where the element of stakeholder engagement also comes in. For employment outcomes or labor risks, we surveyed 608 workers from 77 factories of varying size across 3 garment clusters in India, Tirupur, Bangalore, and Delhi NCR regions. We used the multi-stage proportional sampling technique to ensure that different categories of workers are surveyed. And the most important point I would like to highlight here is that the surveys have been conducted by activists from grassroots, CSOs, worker collectives, and trade union activists in the region. I think this is where our study stands out in contrast to the social audit processes where the local stakeholders are hardly engaged. These are the people, as you know, are the workers trust and are familiar with. So we felt it's very important that they are engaged in this process. For the data on contracting practices, you see on the right, we collected data from 27 supplier companies. Even here, we engaged with the supplier management through a neutral interviewer. Quickly, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. This data that we collected from workers and supplier companies on the 2 pillars or the 2 risk areas that we identified enabled us to arrive at the prevalence and severity of the labor risks in the 3 garment clusters in India. Additionally, we were also able to establish possible linkages between the violations in the shop floor and the contracting practices of the lead firms. So the graph on the right that you see highlights the severity of the risks in each of the 3 garment clusters. Due to paucity of time, I will not go over this in detail, but soon we are going to publish this report and share the framework in the form of a toolkit as well. So we are looking forward to engage with stakeholders on this. I've come to the last part of my presentation. Here I will share some learning around engaging workers in the due diligence process. Our study has established that it is possible to engage workers in the HRDD processes to identify and assess the human rights risks. But while doing so, it is important to keep in mind a few considerations. That is about the when, how, and where of engaging workers, and through whom should they be engaged. So on the question of when to engage, we would say it is very much necessary that workers are engaged at the initial stages of HRDD, and they are continued to be engaged throughout the process, because who else can talk about the issues of workers than workers themselves? And in countries like India, we don't normally see workers represented at the factory level. So that makes it even more important to involve workers in the initial stage of HRDD. But while doing so, what needs to be ensured is that workers are informed of the purpose and the expected outcome of the purpose and how they would be continuously engaged in the process. To the question of how to engage, there are various ways to do that. We used the worker surveys as a method. The next speakers, I'm sure, will also share more about other ways and methods that they have come up. But here, another important thing I want to highlight is the importance of engaging worker representatives and trade unions wherever they are present. So that makes it even more important. On where to engage, it is very important to ask whether factories are the right space for workers to talk about their issues. The shop floor power relations are so skewed that workers have little space to share their perspectives freely. So from our experience, we would say that home and community settings are the places where the workers would open up about their experiences. And the next important factor is through whom the workers are engaged. Here we see social relations play an important role. The people involved in the process should have the trust and familiarity with workers. So in our surveys, we engaged activists from grassroots organizations and workers collectives. I mentioned this before. So these are people from similar socio-economic backgrounds that workers also come from, and they have fostered long-term kind of relationships with workers. In our study, workers opened up about sensitive issues around sexual harassment and abuses, which do not normally come up in audits or other brand-driven processes. So yeah, I mean, thus I would say like all of these factors. When, how, where, and through whom we engage workers is key to stakeholder engagement, especially when you bring in the workers' concerns into the picture. So let me conclude my presentation by saying that HRDD is about workers and communities and addressing the risks faced by them. It is not merely an exercise looking at risks for businesses. So thank you all for the opportunity. Now I request my colleague Margot from CNV International to talk about the role of trade unions in the process of meaningful stakeholder engagement. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pradipan. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Before I start, I believe I wanted to share, I believe there was something wrong with the chat in the beginning, but it should be possible for everyone to use the chat right now. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of that before I start. So now that Pradipan has highlighted the importance of including workers' voice in HRDD processes and meaningful stakeholder engagement, I would like to zoom out a bit more and discuss the role of another stakeholder within the supply chain, which is the trade union. So my name is Margot Offerijns. I'm Program Officer Asia at CNV Internationaal. And we are a Dutch trade union solidarity organization committed to working towards decent work for all, together with our local trade union partners in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So as I'm part of a trade union, it should not come as a surprise that I'm here today to highlight how trade unions specifically can facilitate this process of including workers' voice in stakeholder dialogue. But I would also like to share with you today what the added value is for involving trade unions in these conversations about HRDD policies, because there's added value, I think, to all the parties involved. So I hope that at this point you're convinced that workers do need to be included in meaningful stakeholder engagement, but I can also imagine that you're still wondering how this can best be achieved, because these workers themselves can be difficult to reach for international companies, especially if the workers are located more upstream in the supply chain. So this is really where trade unions can come into the picture, because since they are the one representing these rights holders in their daily work, and are therefore in an excellent position to represent the workers' voice. So in that sense, they can kind of act as a bridge between the international companies and the local workers themselves. So by their nature as a trade union, they have a lot of experience that makes them have added value for stakeholder dialogue. So trade unions are, first of all, in direct contact with the workers. So they are therefore extremely knowledgeable about the situation on the factory floor. But not only that, but also as trade unions, they're used to acting as formal representatives of the workers in social dialogue. So this means that they negotiate collective bargaining agreements with the employers. And so they're therefore already experienced in facilitating and taking part in these kinds of stakeholder meetings, dialogue sessions. This also means that they can help in setting up a kind of feedback loop, which is also a very important step within HRDD and an important step within meaningful stakeholder engagement, I would say as well. Because on the one hand, they can share their account of the potential human rights risks that they see on the factory floor with the international companies. But they can also make sure that the HRDD policies that the companies come up with actually feed back into and improve the lives of the workers in the end. However, unfortunately, we see that there is still often a missing link between international companies and trade unions in production countries. Next slide, please. So there's two parts where we see this missing link. So on the one hand, companies are not always aware of the role that trade unions can play and the opportunity this also presents to get concrete input on their due diligence policies, or they're not really sure how to find these trade unions. But on the other side, you see it as well. So trade unions themselves are also not yet aware of the role that they can have, or sometimes like the positive impact that it could have on workers' rights and the conditions. And they can even be a little skeptical about upcoming HRDD legislation, for example, because they might see it as another thing that should help improve the workers' conditions, but won't in fact. So this is really where the work of CNV Internationaal comes in. So as a trade union solidarity organization, we're working on making sure that this awareness is improved on both sides and that concrete steps are taken to make sure that this type of stakeholder engagement is set up. So we're kind of working on making sure that both sides are more involved and more aware of this. So on the one hand, in our opinion, this really starts with the trade union themselves. So it starts with better preparing them for HRDD legislation, but also making sure that they understand what it means, what it could mean in practice for them. So this is why we've started training trade unions in Cambodia, Vietnam, and Indonesia on HRDD legislation, and also the possible role that all of them could have in each of the 6 steps. So through these trainings, we're making sure we are working on making sure that the trade unions have a stronger position in their interactions with brands when they're discussing HRDD policies. But on the other hand, these trainings have also made it clearer for us, or it's made it easier for us to make it even more specific in what ways trade unions can help improve HRDD policies and the concrete input it could have. So I would like to share a few of these examples with you today. I can't go through all of them, but I've decided to focus on 2 specific steps where we really see an important role for the trade unions, and that really became clear during the trainings themselves. So first of all, it's about the support in step 2, which is identifying adverse impact in the supply chain. So as I've said before, trade unions possess valuable expertise and experience regarding labor conditions, workplace safety, environmental impact, social issues. And these insights can provide companies with a deeper understanding of the underground realities within their supply chains, which will help them in turn to identify risks, but also potential areas for improvement. So we really noticed during the training where we have an exercise for the trade union participants to write down all of the different potential human rights risks in specifically the garment supply chain this time. And you notice that this was actually a relatively easy exercise for them, even though for a lot of people this can be quite difficult because they came up with so many different human rights risks, and also specifically the ones that are often forgotten about in audits, such as freedom of association or trade union rights. But besides that, we also noticed that they often had a lot of knowledge on where the local companies or factories source their materials from, or which other international buyers source from their factory or plantation. So this means that they could also really help in identifying your supply chain. But second of all, there was also some clear examples of the support in step 6 about providing remedy. Because trade unions in their daily work are very often working on gathering complaints from workers, making sure that there's solutions and that they support the workers in this process. So this means that they already have a lot of expertise with complaint mechanisms. So their support in setting up and ensuring the effectiveness of grievance mechanisms would be really crucial, because they can give clear input on how to make sure that grievance mechanisms are accessible for workers, since this is often not yet the case. So with this kind of input, you can also really make sure that a brand's methods for providing remedy are actually impactful and are actually reaching the workers themselves. So as I said, these are just 2 examples of the important input that could be gathered through meaningful stakeholder engagement with trade unions. However, we see potential roles for trade unions in each of the 6 steps. And I can't go into that in detail during this session, but we have also published a more detailed paper on the role of trade unions in all of the 6 steps of due diligence. So we hope that this can be used by trade unions, by brands or other companies, but also other stakeholders to get a better sense of the importance of including trade unions in this process, but also making it really practical for them. So it's basically a more detailed version of the monologue that I'm giving you today. And I'll make sure to add the link to this paper in the chat as well for anyone that would be interested in that. So this paper is also really a way for us to raise more awareness with other stakeholders, since, as I mentioned, we have to improve this missing connection between international companies and trade unions from both sides. So that's why I'm here today, and it's also why I'll be present at the OECD Forum this week. So we'll continue to spread this message in our interactions with brands and other international companies and trying to facilitate this connection even better. So for today, I hope to have shed some more light on the role of trade unions in meaningful stakeholder engagement and HRDD processes in general for you, and that I've been able to demonstrate that including them in stakeholder dialogue presents obvious opportunities for all parties involved. However, to also end on an important note, it is essential to make sure that all of this is a two-way street and based on stakeholder engagement that is meaningful and impactful. So this means that trade unions are not only there for companies to get input and be on their back end call, so to say, but companies also have a responsibility to make sure that this input is not being wasted and that this input is used for actual HRDD policies that help improve the working conditions of the rights holders themselves. So thank you all for today. I would now like to give the floor to Mr. Alagesan from Eastman X-Force, who will talk a little bit more about the important role that suppliers have within meaningful stakeholder engagement. Thank you.
So hi, I'm Alagesan from Eastman Exports. I'm the Senior Vice President taking care of ESG and quality at Eastman Exports. We are one of the largest vertical knitwear exporters from down south India, and my warm wishes to all of you. So today my presentation will talk about the grievance mechanisms, what we are following as Eastman Exports. Yeah, can we go to the next slide? Yeah. So why is grievance mechanism? Everybody knows that it is very important, especially when you as a company we believe in equity, equality, and diversity in our workplace, and so these grievance mechanisms are very important, and and engagement with different stakeholders is quite important to achieve this. Can we go to the next slide? So like I said, why it is important? It is legally, you need to have grievance redressal mechanism in place, and also to have a good communication and dialogue with your workers, which also results in a happy worker when good working, we give them a good atmosphere. And like I said, as a company, we believe in equity, equality, and equality. Can we go to the next slide, Tara? So we have different mechanisms in place. One being the suggestion and the complaint box, which you will find in every manufacturer. We also believe in whistleblower policy. That is why we have different policies in place. We also have, like in my slides, it will show that we have different tools of grievance mechanism, whether it is through app or through Reach CEO, and also trade unions and also labor groups who are a part of my different grievance mechanism committees and all. And they have very in my factories we have engagements with collaborations with NGOs who are a part of my committees. We also collaborate with trade unions, local trade unions, who also have access to my facilities. And like I said, you Reach CEO. This is a hotline which directly communicates with the management. We at Eastman factories are scattered in different locations, so it is important that management has some kind of a control. So we have this Reach CEO, which is a hotline where any grievance, whether it is anonymous or whether it is somebody wants to whistleblow, anybody from outside wants to give some information, they can call up this number, it gets recorded and then passed on to the management. We also have Vovo app, which is through Labor Solutions. It has 26 common languages. So it is a very good digital platform which we provide to all our workers. It is not just on the smartphone, but if people does not have a smartphone, it is also with the regular phone. It uses as a SMS facility. One very good feature of this app is it is in 26 languages. Because most of the time we have more than 40% migrant workers from different other parts of India, so they cannot speak the local language. So this app also provides them their language in their language. It does not just have the grievance mechanism, but it also has different kinds of training tools, and we can do a lot of surveys in it. We can do passing on informations. We can do all this as that. It also has a grievance mechanism specifically with where you can escalate, like the first, the grievance will go to the HR. In another 48 hours, it will go to the next level, the next level. We can like that. We can prioritize how it is being the grievance mechanisms are addressed. Next slide, please. This is the Reach CEO, which I told you, which because we are scattered in different parts of this region, all our factories are. So believe that since the management should have a direct reporting system, so we have this hotline wherein people can just call and anonymously or can raise a grievance, which gets recorded and goes to the management. We also have different committees as per legally requirement or the client's requirement. So this is also plays a vital role, but also one very important part is in our grievance mechanisms like ICC and other committees. We have NGO, we have women lawyers in our committees, and we have also trade unions members in the committees. So it is quite robust grievance mechanism what we have, and even the smallest grievance gets recorded and investigated, or wherever investigation is required, it gets investigated and remediation is provided. The next. So this is like one flow chart how we deal with the grievance mechanism. Any grievance which comes, which gets recorded, which gets as per if it is on a digital platform, then it gets escalated to the first level. If the first level doesn't respond in 48 hours, it goes to the next level, and like that till the and it goes up to the management, and we see to that even the smallest grievance gets addressed and remediations are provided. Due diligence is a very important part, not just for any grievance mechanism to run. Due diligence is very important. We have to carry out due diligence. We have our own due diligence systems wherein we involve NGOs, where we involve trade unions and different other stakeholders, and we continuously monitor. We continue to do assessment, and we gather data and work on it. It also helps me to harmonize my HR practices. It also helps me find or customize my training modules which I have to do in the factory. So this is a very important part which due diligence plays in our grievance mechanism. Next slide. So like I would like to conclude by saying due diligence is, like I said, is a very important and key aspect of any this thing, but at the same time, it is a continuous process, and of grievance mechanism. And all stakeholders engagement is also a continuous process, but brands play a vital role. The partnership with brands is very important, because you can sustain any good initiative or scale it up, any good initiative only if you have a sustained business model in place. Supply chain is always there is a risk in the supply chain, but having a good partnership and a collaborated approach with the brands and other stakeholders is very important to have to sustain the grievance mechanism or good grievance mechanism in place. Thank you.
Thank you for handing back the floor, and thank you to our first three speakers. So in this first block, we have learned how workers, trade unions, and suppliers have to play an active role in meaningful stakeholder engagement. And in order for brands to create real and long-lasting impact, they need to integrate that knowledge and those insights from the stakeholders in their due diligence process. And when this is done correctly, this can lead to unseen or sensitive issues to be raised. So what types of engagement can be used for this will vary from context and situation, but in the next block, you will hear some examples where meaningful stakeholder engagement was implemented successfully. And these tools and examples can be applied at various steps of the due diligence process. And again, it's by no means an all-encompassing overview of the tools available, but it gives a short impression of what projects we are working on within Stitch. So with that, I would like to give the floor to the first speaker, Enrico Otang from TURC, which is a partner of Mondiaal FNV.
Thank you, Tara, and hi everyone. My name is Enrico Otang. I'm working for the Trade Union Rights Center. So Trade Union Rights Center is a labor NGO who provides a support for the trade unionists in order to promote and achieve decent work, in particularly in apparel and plantation sector industries. We would like to share the experience about meaningful stakeholders engagements from an approach taken by 4 labor rights organizations consortiums, including Mondiaal FNV, Wage Indicator, Gajimu.com, and TURC. We're working with the 3 national trade union federation, including SPN, GATEX, KSBSI, and TSK SPSI. So the stakeholder engagement approach is named by the Makin Terang initiative as a case study for Indonesia. So I would like to start with what is Makin Terang initiative. So the Makin Terang initiative is an approach to improve working conditions by using workers-driven data for monitor working conditions, conducting social dialogue across supply chain, and trade union organizing in Java Island where the industry exists. So this approach collects information from workers at the lowest level in the supply chain. We believe that workers' experience and knowledge are essential to be able to show actual working conditions, find space for dialogue with the key relevant stakeholders, and try to find an agreement on various aspects of working conditions that need to be improved. So we would like to share to you about the workflow of the approach on workers-driven social responsibility in this initiative. So I would like to start with the first questions, how this initiative works. So interviewers from the trade union visited and collected data to surveys to find out working conditions in the company using national legal instrument to map the factory's level of compliance. There are 2 types of surveys carried out in this initiative. The first is called a decent work check, and the second one is a working priority polls. These 2 surveys are instruments used by the trade union to obtain data about working conditions, company compliance, and determine priority issues that will be voices and dialogue with various stakeholders, especially with the factories management. So then the capacity strengthening is given to the team of the trade union negotiators to be able to analyze the data that has been collected. They can map various issues they find out, and they try to find out the root causes of the problems, building an argument and formulate recommendations to be voiced and negotiated with the factories management. Then next step, finding the right social dialogue channel also has an essential role in supporting the success of the trade union in raising an issues for the negotiations with the factories management. This takes into account the complexity of unequal power relations between companies and the trade union, especially in the factories that have multiple unions. Of course, there are always failures and success as a result of the negotiations. We believe that everything must be monitored, and lesson learned can be learned to provide a future improvement, so that therefore the final stage of the work cycle of this initiative is workers-based monitoring. So gender mainstreaming is very essential for this initiative. This initiative wants to ensure that the trade unions effectively represent all workers and their interests, especially for the women workers. Therefore, this initiative applies the principles of no one left behind in the midst of the male dominations in the trade union management structures, women's voices as the majority constituent, especially in the sectors, must be ensured to be heard, accommodated, and voiced at the negotiations table. So for this reason, several affirmative actions has been carried out as follows. First, the trade union identifies women workers' issues by using decent work check as a tools, consulting with the Women's Workers Committee and setting up the priority. Second one, involving the representative of the Women Workers Committee to the negotiation team. And the third one, strengthening the capacity of the negotiation team. It's not only limited to women, but also men with a gender mainstreaming approach. Ensure that male trade union officials can be more sensitive in capturing and voicing issues of female workers. One of the steps taken by the trade union to voice the rights of the women workers is by encouraging gender-responsive CBA negotiations with the factories management. So I would like to share the experience how the trade union using data is being used in the factories level to promote women workers issues actually. So this case is happening in the factories located in the West Java. So using the decent work check, the trade union can identify there are some issues concerning to the women workers' rights. There are lack of fulfillment of the women workers' rights, including there are no facilities and also given time provided by the factories management for the breastfeeding. So there are these two issues coming up as a demand of the trade union, and then the trade union trying to identify several kinds of data that can be used. So there are several supportive data used by the trade union. Actually, they use the decent work check as a tools to find out the issues and the problems. And they tell this kind of surface to the factories management. And they're also using the labor law related regulation. And they also use the CBA database reference provided by this initiative. The CBA database is used by the trade union to seek reference of how other CBAs regulated the issues. So it also gives the trade union a reference on the redactional test to be proposed in the draft of CBA. And they also use the public research on side effect for women workers and child if they don't have any these facilities. So I mean, the trade union successfully convinced the factories management about the importance and also the benefits company and the benefits for the company, I mean, if they provided facilities for the time and room for the breastfeeding. So as a result, the trade union and the factories management agreed to include these two facilities in their extension CPA. So furthermore, it's important for us to always monitor the progress and results the local dialogue in factories level happen. So when the trade union and the factory level use the survey findings in their social dialogue, we also measure topic discussed. And we also measure the topic agreed and considered as an improvement by the trade union. From the data, we could track the trends and also the changes and the improvement agreed within the factories over time. So in carrying out engagement, both parties can map issues that are relatively easy to difficult to reach an agreement. So we can map actually the structural changes that need to be made and which issues need more attention to minimize the risk of the industrial relations conflicts. So as a lesson learned from this initiative, we believe that the evidence-based or database advocacy model is really encouraging the positions of both parties, the trade union and the companies, to be really accountable, transparent, and equal in conducting collective bargaining in the factories. So workers-driven social responsibility is really encouraging the meaningful stakeholders' engagement to implement accountability and the transparency within the supply chain. So we are really encouraged for the suppliers and also brands it's trying to this model, and we open if there's any suppliers that are not really under survey, we are open to be involved the suppliers in the surveys. So thank you for the opportunity. I would like to pass to my colleague Trang from the CDA to share about the WeCheck apps. So please, Trang.
Yes, thank you, Ota. And can you move to my slide, Tara? Hello, everyone. The Center for Development and Integration, CDI, is Vietnamese non-government organization working for the rights of disadvantaged people to build a society of equity, solidarity, and sustainable development. For many years, working with the workers in the garment and textile industry, we have developed and maintained the WeCheck app. And my name is Chang, and in charge of labor rights program coordinator. And today I will present to all of you about the WeCheck application and the collective worker voice on working conditions. My presentation has 4 main parts, including the introduction of the WeCheck app, the approach for collecting worker voice, the key results from the worker assessment, and using the results for promoting better working conditions. Now I will start it with my first part. You can see in the screen is the name and the logo of the WeCheck applications. It is a friendly and two-way communication tool designed for workers to educate and raise their knowledge on international and national labor legislations, proactively assess and track working conditions and occupational health status over time, send the complaint to relevant stakeholder and request legal aid, a complaint handle, and also raise individual and collective voice on worker issue. This app is free for use and now are available in both Apple Store and Google Play. The WeCheck have 6 main functions in total. 2 of those functions are meaningful to HRTD and MSE. The first one is working condition assessment. This function is developed based on its core international labor standard and designed in the form of a worker lifestyle. By using this app, workers can regularly assess and check their working condition inside the factory, receive automatic results and suggestions to improve the working condition from their perspective. In addition, they also may know the overarching status of the company compliant to international labor standards, in case that more and more workers inside the factory using this function together. The second function is advice and answer. It focuses on labor legislation and occupational health status, health topic. A worker can send their complaint to relevant stakeholder and request legal aid, complaint handle. And in the case that the complaint is verified a real complaint, the WeCheck app will kick off next step for remedy, and all relevant stakeholder can join in the same system to handle the worker complaint. From CDI side, when having the worker input, we will check the data and analyze the data and prepare different kinds of reports. It may include the compliance report for international labor standard, the risk assessment reports, and the common worker complaint reports. All the reports are written from worker perspective. And although the compliance reports for international labor standard can divide in different levels, such as sectorial levels, company levels, in the supply chain levels, in the context that the knowledge of supply chain is widely shared by the buyer or by the brands. And of course, the compliance reports will be released every year, so it may show the change among or change on working condition among different periods of worker assessment. And the risk assessment reports can focus on some labor topics such as forced labor, discrimination, as work, and etc. And for the next part, I will show you some example of this kind of reports. Next slide, please. And now I will move to part 2, approach for collecting worker voice. When developing the WeCheck app, CDI had a vision that from year to year, the worker input can become big data, and multi-stakeholder can take advantage from using the input from workers to promote better working conditions in the garment industry. And to make it come true, we have developed and practiced some key principles. They are including, come back to the, it is applying the worker-driven monitoring and using the snowball technique. It means that workers are the center of the monitoring, and they can proactively lead the process of rolling out the WeCheck app and collecting the worker voice. CDI go along with them, inspire and provide technical support for the core workers. The other two principles are also important in ensuring the independent worker voice and data privacy. And each year, CDI will try to conduct from 1 to 2 times a worker assessment and show the worker the individual effectory result of the assessment. And other multi-stakeholder can also access to the reports and use the finding and the recommendation from the report to improve the working condition for the workers. As promised, I will show you some example of key results from the worker assessment. Here is the first one, the compliance report to international labor standard from worker perspective. The worker input were analyzed by international labor standard as shown in the pink shade here. And the compliance report will show you the average compliance score for all 8 international labor standards from worker perspective. Next slide, please. And also, it will show you the detailed result for each international labor standard. And up here, we will mark you the zero tolerance violation that can be seen in the practice of the company here. Together with the data, we also explain the meaningful behind the data and show you the recommendation for relevant stakeholders aiming at promoting the better working condition for the workers. And the second example is the risk assessment on the forced labor from worker perspective. We using the pool of worker input and select the data linked to the risk assessment. For example, the discrimination of forced laborers at work, and then we will prepare the report format like the same previous format, and also including the data and the recommendation for stakeholders to find the gap and develop solution to mitigate the risk. And lastly, we use that from the WeCheck app, we can have different kinds of output, like the reports, the worker voice, the question, a worker complaint. So the output here can be used in different levels, like in the company level, national level, and international level. The input can be used by different stakeholders such as CSO, trade unions, law, and other as an input for action to promote better working condition for the worker. And the other stakeholder like the factory manager, the trade union, the service provider, and the brand. Also, the Molisa and Dolisa can use the worker voice as an input and take it into account for their action for better working condition. So for more detail, you can see the slide and see the detail here. And come back to the cycle of the HRDD. By using the WeCheck app, worker voice can contribute to many steps of HRDD implementation, such as policy, identify and assess adverse impacts, seize and prevent or mitigate the risk, also track and remediate for the risks. So in conclusion, I have to say that the engagement is only meaningful if stakeholders are aware of how their input will be used. No one understands about a worker working condition like they do themselves. So the engagement of multi-stakeholder is truly meaningful when the worker voice are listened to. and yielded an input for the board step of conducting due diligence. I will end my presentation here. Thank you so much for your listening, and I will hand over to my partner Elisa from ETI with the presentation on a common framework on responsible purchasing practice supply engagement briefing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great to be joining the session today. I think hopefully you can see my slides now and everything's working well. I'm going to be speaking to you about stakeholder engagement in the context of purchasing practices with a particular focus on supplier engagement. My name is Elisa Shepherd. I work at the Ethical Trading Initiative. We bring together businesses, trade unions, and NGOs to help understand and mitigate human rights risks in supply chains. In recent years, ETI has been working in close partnership with the organizations that you see here. We've been working together to support businesses to progress towards responsible purchasing practices. As a group, we developed the common framework, which consists of 5 principles of responsible purchasing. In parallel to this, we've been working with a community of brands to support them to make improvements to their purchasing practices. We are just over a year into this community initiative now, and we're getting some really good insights into what is working well and where there are some common challenges. So I'd like to share some of those insights with you today. A typical dynamic that we see is a lack of alignment between commercial teams and social responsibility, who each have conflicting expectations of the supplier. Frequently, the immediate commercial pressures take priority and they end up undermining a supplier's ability to meet expectations when it comes to working conditions. A fundamental step to improving purchasing practices is to start to connect these groups together, to get them communicating and working towards a shared goal that actually takes into account the impacts on workers. Excuse me, I'll go back. So what I'm really trying to highlight here is the importance of commercial teams actually getting involved to understand how their own actions relate to the impacts on workers and being part of the development of improvements to those ways of working. The work that we are doing has really highlighted the importance of a human rights due diligence approach. Purchasing practices is not a one-size-fits-all. So, for example, a lot of the issues relate to skewed power dynamics and dependencies, and this plays out very differently for, say, a large high street retailer buying 500,000 units from a supplier in Bangladesh than it does for an SME who might be buying 100 units from a supplier that might actually be significantly bigger than they are. So the dependencies and the power dynamics and the opportunity for leverage play out very differently, as do the human rights risks, as do the solutions. So companies really need to be seeking to understand the risks for workers in the context of their own supply chains and how their business model and their practices relate to the root causes of those risks, and then adopt purchasing practices that appropriately address those risks. This diagram shows you the process that we're working through with our community of brands. The first steps are focused on bringing together cross-functional teams within the brand, connecting up the relevant individuals to develop a shared understanding of their current purchasing practices. An essential part of this process is to be getting supplier feedback. The supplier is a key stakeholder in this relationship and the one with the most direct influence over conditions for workers. Purchasing practices are problematic when they inhibit the supplier's ability or incentive to prioritize decent work. So understanding the challenges from the supplier's perspective is absolutely key in order to be able to address them. All of this feedback then needs to be considered alongside other human rights due diligence insights. What are we hearing from workers to understand the impacts that they are experiencing, and how are the insights on the day-to-day practices and the supplier feedback connected to these risks? And then, of course, we need to be brainstorming solutions, trialing these out, and embedding the ones that work sustainably into the business. Meaningful stakeholder engagement needs to happen at every step of this process. So brands should be working in partnership with suppliers to develop solutions, and they should be getting continuous feedback and input on how these are working out. So moving on to some practical insights. To support our community of brands, we developed this supplier engagement briefing. It captures some practical advice on ways to gather feedback and keep ongoing dialogue. And you can download this from the Common Framework website. A very popular way to collect feedback is through supplier surveys. So done well, this enables brands to get honest feedback from their supply base, to evidence the impact of purchasing practices, which is incredibly valuable when it comes to engaging leadership teams and other internal functions. And it gives a solid baseline to gauge progress over time. However, suppliers are getting really quite fed up of being surveyed. It's a significant drain on resource, and this really needs to be weighed up before undertaking any kind of survey. Another point to consider is that surveys don't actually in themselves build those communication bridges. They provide some really valuable information from your suppliers, but you still need a plan about how to build that collaborative solution finding. So some practical tips for purchasing companies. You need to make sure that you have a plan for analyzing the results and for what the next steps are going to be. If you're going to ask suppliers to give up precious time to answer surveys, you need to make sure that you're making it worth their while. Often we see retailers who receive the survey results and actually they freeze because they're overwhelmed with quite a lot of data, and there's a big gap between that milestone and knowing what to do with it. And you do need to take action. Supplier feedback does not fix purchasing practices. That's in the hands of the purchasing companies. So if you are asking for feedback and doing nothing with it, you're actually making the problem worse. So what we would recommend is, firstly, share that aggregated feedback to your supply base to keep that transparency. Then follow up with face-to-face dialogue with your suppliers to communicate your takeaways from those results, your ideas for improvement, and allow them to input and to influence those ideas. Keep that communication going, and this is going to serve you really well when it's time to make those changes, as everyone is going to understand where you are coming from and they're going to be primed and ready to collaborate. Another really important point is to communicate before you send out the survey. So we've heard several stories of suppliers assuming that purchasing practices surveys are another audit. These kinds of misunderstandings are not going to give you the type of answers or engagement that you're looking for. So the purpose of the survey needs to be clear. Best practice would be to communicate the full plan of your intentions to make improvement and what you're going to do with the results. Finally, this communication will be far more persuasive if it comes from a senior contact on the commercial side of the business. So do have a think about who should be leading on this communication. Another very important way to communicate is to actually speak to your suppliers. What we are witnessing is that if the conversation is framed sensitively and the intentions to improve purchasing practices are clear and they're backed up by action, suppliers are actually very willing to open up about their experience. The early stages of our work have really been about emphasizing this need for communication and getting that to happen in practice. So a year into this initiative now, and we have some really wonderful examples of this working. So these include social responsibility, commercial and suppliers having regular meetings together. Brands are also increasing the frequency of their engagement with suppliers and opting for more face-to-face interaction. And we can genuinely say that these conversations are getting deeper, they're getting more free-flowing and more focused on practical changes and joint problem solving, which are really important building blocks to be making improvements. The focus on building a cross-functional team internally within the brand is also working really well. Suppliers tend to have strong relationships with particular buyers and merchandisers, and for those individuals to be leading the conversations on improving the relationship and ways of working and seeking to improve their own practices is really meaningful. So finally, I'd just like to say that our work today has been quite focused on the behavior of retailers and brands, because there's been a need for clear progress in that space. But this work exists in a much wider ecosystem, as we've been hearing today, and as we're hearing from many of the OECD sessions. There's a lot of really valuable work happening, and we will continue to reach out and promote industry alignment. On that note, I'm going to hand back over to Tara. Thank you so much.
So thank you to the second round of speakers. And in this second round, we heard the importance of collaboration. And hopefully, even though these presentations were short, you got some insights and inspiration for the possibilities that exist for meaningful stakeholder engagement. So the tools that were presented were co-developed by stakeholders and or their representatives. So hopefully, as you've seen, this makes the input and the meaningful stakeholder engagement so much stronger when this input is used. The tools we have just discussed are only one way, three different ways that you've seen, but there are many more methods and tools out there that exist, both that we use within Stitch, but also that are used by other industry actors. So in order for meaningful stakeholder engagement to be effective, we need to look for a more industry-wide solution. So this was a question we wanted to open the floor up to and discuss with you. But before we go into that, we'll discuss some questions that you have posted in the chat. There have been many interesting questions to several of the speakers. As a first one, we received one maybe for Cividep or for others, so feel free to jump into all of the speakers. And that was how do you engage with workers when there's no real trade union or worker representation present? So it was maybe for Cividep, you can jump in if you want, or maybe one of the other speakers.
Yeah, I think that's what I also covered in my presentation. In most cases, in India, we don't have trade unions at the factory level. So we have sectoral trade unions. We have smaller collectives of workers, which have not been recognized in the workplaces for negotiation or bargaining. So so we closely work with them and see how and support them and how they can take up the issues of workers. So in Bangalore, I think we are closely working with 2-3 such smaller trade unions, and we are also trying to see how these trade unions, the smaller ones, can take support from the mainstream trade unions, because the mainstream bigger trade unions are not organizing in the garment sector. We are also looking at what role can Cividep do, or NGOs can do in bridging that gap. So we are also trying to see how such conversations could be opened up between these smaller worker collectives and bigger trade union, and see how organized workers' voice get represented in these dialogues. So yes, over to you, Tara. I hope I answered the question.
Okay, thank you. And your screen, by the way, is off, Paripan. I don't know if that's on purpose for the internet, but yeah, we cannot see you. Oh, there you are. Yeah, great. Hello. I don't know if one of the other speakers really would like to add to that. Otherwise, I'm moving on, because we have so many questions, then I'm moving on. Okay, so apart from anonymity, how do suppliers make workers feel safe to use a grievance mechanism? I think this was an interesting question as well.
Tara, I can take that.
Yeah.
So one, you have to gain a confidence with the workers. It's The moment you introduce any tools or mechanism, you need to. It is a systematic behavioral change. That is the toughest part, and that can be done. It will not happen overnight. It needs a lot of counseling and a lot of collaboration with NGOs or with trade unions, at different levels. And there has to be a clear communication from the management intention, and like in our case, we made it a mandatory that management, whenever the management teams are in the shop floor, we interact with workers. We tell them if they have any issues and things like that. So so like I said, it is not going to happen overnight, and you need to collaborate with a lot of stakeholders, like NGOs or trade unions and other labor group organizations who come, and also due diligence part is very important. You understand what kind of grievances you are getting, from where it is coming, and things like that. That only can make them confidence. And once it starts happening, and once the people start getting this confidence that they can transparently and they can raise any grievance without any fear of any retaliation, and then it helps. It just multiplies, and in a very short span, you see there is a good communication between the management and the workers. And the middle management plays a vital role. Normally, what happens? Everyone forgets about the middle management. Middle management is the most difficult and also most important link in this for any grievance mechanism to work swiftly and in a robust way. Thank you.
Thank you for your answer, and again for emphasizing how important it is to collaborate with different stakeholders in addressing these issues. In relation to that, we also received another interesting question, because now we just heard from you as a supplier. Another question was how brands can effectively support local trade unions. So that's another collaboration within the industry that's interesting. We have two trade unions here present who might want to address this, but also we have a brand representative, of course, or a multi-stakeholder initiative that works closely with brands. So different speakers that might want to answer this. I see, Margot, you have unmuted yourself.
Yeah, maybe I can start. I think because I think there's many different answers to this question, and I think also Eliza highlighted some of them in her presentation as well. But from my side, I think one of the most important things, what I said as well, is that all of this should be seen as a two-way street. And that means that it's very important for brands to show that in practice, that they're willing to make changes themselves as well, and that they're able to kind of pay up in a way. So by, for example, improving their purchasing practices, etc. So to really demonstrate to trade unions that that they are in support of the work that they're doing, and also in practice supporting this. So for example, I think there's many examples popping up of conversation happening more at tripartite level, like social dialogue. For example, right now in Cambodia, you have ACT present, where they're having discussions or negotiating a collective bargaining agreement between employers, brands, and trade unions. And I think this is a really important example of how brands can become part of this conversation on improving their purchasing practices, for example, which can strengthen the position of trade unions within social dialogue and when discussing collective bargaining agreements as well. So to really ensure that they take their responsibility as well when it comes to improving the situation at the factory level, I would say.
Thank you for answering this. Okay, I'm looking at the time. We have 5 minutes left still, many questions to go. But now we have still everyone present here. I would like to round it off and invite you to continue this conversation. So I'm sorry if your question wasn't discussed. But we, as I said, we also had a question to you, and that was how we can create alignment in meaningful stakeholder engagement in the textile and garment sector. Now, unfortunately, we didn't have time to start a discussion on this, but if you have thoughts on this, then please reach out to us. And also, if your question wasn't answered, or I see there's a lot of discussions going on in the chat as well, yeah, we're happy to continue this conversation and work towards more industry alignment on this topic. So then please feel free to reach out to my colleague, Quirin Lenkik, through the email address that's provided on the screen here. Or of course, if you run into one of the speakers during the OECD forum in Paris, then you can continue the conversation there. Thanks a lot. If you missed something, I see there were some power cuts for some people. If you've missed part of this presentation, it was being recorded, so you can always watch back this presentation, and we'll be sharing the link. So thanks a lot for being present, for your interesting questions in the chat, and maybe we'll see you in one of the other sessions or side sessions coming up this week. Enjoy the rest of the forum.